We don't have to agree, but we can at least recognize that we're not bad people just because we don't agree with each other about this or that. I'm just wondering, I can agree with that, but how much traction does that have when the conflicts that we're talking about are as sharply drawn as those that I've been referring to just now? And there's a partisan divide for a reason, because people have, as you would acknowledge, I'm sure, different values, judgments, assessments, commitments, and whatnot. How much of this needs to be accommodated because it's a part of the political reality? People don't agree about these things. They're going to argue about them, and only one side can win.
This idea that if we are committed to seeing the dignity in our opponents, we can push forward the material policies of American society in ways that reflect that. And even if we disagree on that, we can still find a way to strive towards the beloved community across those divisions. That message has been a wellspring of hope for America since that time, and that was solidified by King's assassination in a way, not without saying too much, in a way that sort of reflects the Christian conviction.
This is Glenn Loury. You have tuned into The Glenn Show. I am with John Wood Jr., and we're going to have a conversation. John Wood Jr. is National Ambassador for the Braver Angels Project, which he can describe in greater detail, an effort to facilitate dialogue across the partisan divide amongst Americans in this time of such division. And they've just had their annual convention, and he's a national leader for the organization, and we're going to talk about what the organization does and whatnot. John has been a guest on The Glenn Show in the past on several occasions where we've talked about this work, but it's been a while, and so it's good to catch up. John, an old friend. Welcome to The Glenn Show, John.
Glenn, it is a pleasure as always. It's great to be back on with you.
Let me mention that we're sponsored by the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research in New York City, and I'm grateful for their support. And we are in a time of some partisan conflict. I mean, a presidential election is underway, and there was an assassination attempt on the Republican candidate. The Democratic candidate has just announced his historic withdrawal from the race. And knives are out, people calling each other names. There's all kinds of arguments going on about foreign policy, about domestic affairs, about what's going on at the border, about abortion, about democracy. So it's a rich field for those who are trying to promote inter-ideological dialogue. And I'm wondering how much progress you think you're making over there at Braver Angels there, John.
Yeah, indeed. Well, yeah, thank you very much again, Glenn, for the opportunity to talk a little bit about it. Braver Angels is it's an interesting entity. Let me sort of draw out for people just what exactly it is, although to a certain degree it's somewhat challenging to fully encapsulate. But Braver Angels, this is the canned description here. Braver Angels is America's largest bipartisan, cross-partisan, grassroots organization dedicated to the work of political depolarization. I deepen that sometimes by saying that what we're really about is reviving the communal spirit of American democracy, if you will. We have work that we do across sectors of society, including programs in Congress, every level of government, state, municipal, even school board, work that we do on college campuses across America, opening up spaces for debate and free speech, digital media work. I've hosted podcasts for Braver Angels, Braver Angels podcast, Monica Guzman, my colleague, Braver Way, incredible commentator and empathetic journalist. We have a singer-songwriter community, artists, musicians who leverage music and theater and comedy in efforts to create space for goodwill and common ground. But we're rooted in local communities with about 100 or so local bipartisan alliances. You can think of them as local chapters, where we do the work of through workshops dedicated to fostering the sharing of personal experiences across the political divide, to instructional courses that teach people how to communicate empathetically across political divisions, to one-on-one conversational scripts that help us address political conflicts within families, across generational divides, even geographical and class divides. We provide a full suite, if you will, of resources and materials that are applicable across sectors and across communities to help people navigate political divisions, but again, rooted in sort of a grassroots culture that really began with helping people deal with political fallout at the kitchen table, right? And so Brave Angels is a membership organization, roughly some 13,000 or so members strong. We're volunteer driven. I'm a paid member of staff. We do have a paid staff, but about 3,000 or so trained volunteers across America, regional, state, local level leadership. And that gives you a sense as to sort of the anatomical layout of Braver Angels as sort of an entity. To try and say a little bit more about it, I actually want to say a little bit about the limitations of Braver Angels and why this work has been a bit of a hard sell in some sense, despite the truth of what you just said a moment ago, Glenn. The fact that we live in a time of, it's tempting to say unprecedented polarization. That's probably not quite true. But a time that is uniquely challenging with respect to polarization that faces us for a variety of reasons. But Braver Angels, as a membership organization, engages people across the aisle, but is principally, we're bipartisan in our leadership, largely left-leaning in our membership. Most of our members are...
Did you say largely left-leaning in your membership?
Largely left-leaning in our membership. A slim majority of our members are individuals who vote Democrat, with a strong cohort of Republicans and independents. It probably breaks down in sort of about the 60, 30, 20 sort of Democrats, independents, and Republicans, really blue, others, and reds. Everybody who's identifies themselves as blue may not be a registered Democrat, but they vote left. Same thing going the other direction. A strong majority of our members are baby boomers, although we have strong engagement on college campuses with partner organizations. And most of our members are educated. They're people with college degrees, typically speaking, although we have specific programs dedicated to working class outreach and working class engagement. And lastly, a strong majority of our folks are white, though we have, key leaders and folks who obviously come from other ethnic backgrounds. I say all that in a bit of a spirit of candor, because the challenge facing America today in terms of, I think, reconciling us towards a more functional body politic has to do with the challenges of gathering people into a culture of conversation who have not just ideological conflicts, but identity-based impasses between them that can make it very difficult for them to sort of speak the same language. And Braver Angels, I don't believe, can effectively achieve its larger mission unless we come to a place of more adequately reflecting the larger, both ideological as well as demographic composition of American society.
There's a lot of information. No, I mean, you've been holding forth about what Braver Angels is and what it does. I want to just ask a few questions. I mean, one is, what does it mean, membership? Is that a dues-paying thing? Or what does it mean to be, you say you're grassroots? What does that mean? And your effectiveness, how do you assess whether or not the various activities that you describe are making a difference on the ground? What would be a outcome that you could observe that would tell you that you were making progress on stated goals of the organization and so on? You were talking about the demographic composition of the organization, and I thought that was interesting too. But I maybe you could just address yourself to some of my kind of process questions about what the organization actually does. Where did the funding come from for the work that you guys do, et cetera?
Yeah, happy to. So yes, it is a dues-paying member organization. You can really decide how much you want to give by way of dues. It's a minimum of $12 a year, so that, of course, averages out to $1 a month. So it's not a prohibitive cost. And in being a member, you have the opportunity to engage as a volunteer, to be a part of a local Braver Angels Alliance, to be trained to actually conduct debates and workshops of different kinds. I can go into the details of what that looks like. But membership gives you the opportunity for full participation in the activities of the organization. although most people who participate in Brave Angels programs are not members, so that's worth saying. But if you're going to be an organizer or leader within the organization, membership is required. What does it mean for Brave Angels to be grassroots? That chiefly means that the people who work with Brave Angels are not typically elected officials, although we do work with a wide range of candidates and politicians. They're not individuals who work for the government directly or typically are not university deans or professors, although we do have the Scholars Council, about 150 or so academics who, in one way or another, contribute to our work. But basically, we're grassroots insofar as most of our folks are people who may have one background or another, but come to us from local communities, come to us from any range of professions or backgrounds or lack thereof, and find themselves participating as American citizens. That's really the only criteria for engagement, is that you are an American, right? And embrace the concept of citizenship. I don't mean that as a legal technicality. I mean that as a mode of operation, as a belief that in being a part of the fabric of American society, you have some ownership over the health of the civic body and the trajectory of our democracy. And then your last point, where does the funding come from? We our funding breaks down in about three categories that would be grants, gifts from individual donors of a higher net worth, and then member dues. And that breaks out about 50, 20, 30. So about a half of our funding comes from foundations, and about 20% from higher net worth individuals writing larger checks, and about 30% from the smaller dollar membership giving. And the one thing I'll say about the foundation grants that we receive is that it is a policy of ours to seek, as much as is possible, a strict red-blue balance in our sources of funding on the philanthropic side. And so, most foundations don't want to identify themselves in partisan fashion, and yet certainly in the democracy space, you have some who by reputation and association clearly sort of lean one direction or the other. And so, we have received funding over the years from the Fetzer Institute, from the Templeton Foundation, from the Hewlett Foundation, from the Stand Together Foundation, which is a wing of the Koch Foundation, and so forth. And so, happy to air our laundry a bit on that front as well. But it is a part of the ethos and the integrity of the organization that we be red-blue balanced as much as is possible, both in terms of our sources of funding as well as in the composition of our leadership, and aspirationally, at least, in the composition of our membership. Although, as I've said, we've fallen short of that to date.
So you do seminars? How do you engage the rank and file across the partisan divide? You mentioned training. Mm-hmm. So what does the day-to-day work of the organization look like? And again, how do you know you're making a difference?
Mm-hmm. I'll give you snapshot illustrations of some of our different activities. There's a suite of workshops that engages different parts of the civic anatomy, if you will, of different individuals. And so we have something called a Skills for Bridging the Divide workshop, which again takes people step by step through tactics of communication that are meant to create space for genuine understanding as opposed to conflict right off the bat, right? So we show people the importance of being able to paraphrase the positions of their partners in a cross-partisan conversation. Am I characterizing your view on abortion by saying you don't believe that women should be able to do what they choose with their bodies? Or am I accurately paraphrasing or reflecting the way you think about your position, hypothetical you, by saying, okay, you're somebody who believes in the sanctity of the life of the unborn, that even the unborn are entitled to the rights and dignity as human beings under the law. We have a workshop, our first workshop, called a Red and Blue workshop, where we take people in small groups from the right and from the left, not in this instance to argue or debate policy, but to speak from the vantage point of their own personal or lived experience, if you will, with respect to why it is and how it is they've come to see politics the way that they do in the first place. It's very literally the application of marriage counseling techniques to the relationship between Republicans and Democrats. So that's an example. We have something called a Braver Angels debate program, which is very popular on college campuses and that we deploy both in person and via Zoom, which is essentially sort of a community, almost town hall parliamentary style debate format where the focus is not on defeating the other side, but in addition to marshaling one's facts and evidence, also stresses the importance of being candid about one's both personal experiences in relation to a given issue, whether it be immigration or criminal justice reform or what have you, as well as calling upon people to be honest about their personal doubts, even with respect to their own opinions on a given issue. We ask people in debating and defending their position to also feel comfortable acknowledging where they may feel as if their information or their point of view might potentially fall short of what's true, where they're leaning more on emotion and bias than they may be on what they, strictly speaking, know for certain by way of data and information. So the goal there is intellectual humility and the communal pursuit of truth, if you will, strengthening the bonds of community even while we challenge each other to think more critically about a given issue together. There are about 17 more examples of these sorts of programs that I can run through, but you get sort of perhaps a sense of the spread of activities. Now, your second question, how do we know whether or not we're being effective? There are two levels to that question, Glenn, or at least the answer to that question. And on the first part of it, I feel pretty good. On the second part of it, I feel that we've got a long way to go, even given the length that we've already traveled here as an organization and a community, and even a larger aspirational movement towards reviving goodwill in society. On the first front, we have qualitative evaluations led in many instances by a researcher named Eliza Tanner Hawkins from Brigham Young University, although there have been several other university studies conducted with respect to the efficacy of individual Braver Angels models and workshops, which are able to pretty firmly establish a measure through pre and post surveys and longitudinal surveys, a measurable shift in the affective polarization, that is, the personal feeling of sort of intergroup distrust and contempt that exists between participants in our workshops prior to participating in a certain activity and after participating in a given activity. So in other words, we are able to assess just how polarized an individual may be. A Republican might feel against Democrats in general prior to participating in one of our workshops. And then after the experience of participating in one of our programs, through responses, through questionnaires, surveys conducted over a length of time, we're able to see how the needle has moved towards that individual feeling a greater sense of understanding, a greater sense of compassion, a greater sense of goodwill, really, towards people who identify differently than that individual does politically. So we have a reasonable data set testifying to the effectiveness of our methods. So, there's impact on that level, sort of the level of personal effect, right? Now then, however, the larger mission of Brave Angels is ultimately to through an infrastructure that is meant to span institutions, geography, and demography, essentially cross-pollinate these methods as well as the norms of goodwill and civic trust and communication that they tend to catalyze across the wider spectrum of American civil society and political society, with the hope and the conviction that with enough of that cross-pollination, we may be able to generate something of a virtuous cycle by which the deteriorating norms of civic discourse as they exist across the sort of spectrum, again, of institutions and communities in American life, that the tendency to not be able to tolerate free speech in certain places, the difficulty of being able to establish interpersonal trust in the classroom, in boardroom, corporations, within actual governing spaces, the difficulty with which elected officials themselves have in communicating effectively with their own constituents, given the toxicity of the larger political climate. The hope is to essentially circulate antibodies that can begin to counteract these devolving norms as they exist in the present moment and introduce, the word vaccine, it may be politically loaded at this point, I don't know. But again, introduce something that can begin to catalyze a healthy way of running these. The idea.
I assume you're nonpartisan. There's no red or blue leaning, although you said that the makeup of the membership is disproportionately left of center. I assume, I don't know, what do you say about the issues? What do you say about Gaza, Genocide Joe? What do you say about Ukraine, if anything? What do you say about inflation? What do you say about abortion? And I'm not asking you for a platform in asking these questions. I'm asking for how it is that you engage with these issues in your work with people to bridge a partisan divide. I mean, there's a partisan divide for a reason, because people have, as you would acknowledge, I'm sure, different values, judgments, assessments, commitments, and whatnot. How much of this needs to be accommodated because it's a part of the political reality? People don't agree about these things. They're going to argue about them, and only one side can win. Anyway, I'm asking how you surf the wave of the conflict.
Right.
Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, just spoke to the United States Congress last night about the conflict in Gaza and elsewhere. He wants the U.S. and Iran, the U.S. to grapple with the challenge that the Iranian aggression and Islamist threat. He says, I'm just giving this as an example. You can address it if you want to. He says, this is not a conflict between civilizations. This is a conflict between civilization and barbarism. This is his characterization. Some members of the U.S. Congress refused to attend his speech. There's a real conflict going on. People are raising scores of millions of dollars to fund political campaigns around this conflict, et cetera. So that's just one issue. There are many issues. Can you deal with the problem of partisanship without actually getting a little bit partisan yourself? Do you have to take sides on some of these issues sometimes? Are some political participants so disruptive of the domestic tranquility that they need to be called out for that? I mean, is Donald Trump over the line, for example, in the way that he talks about immigrants or the way that he talks about his political opponents? And dare the constituents of Bravery Angels take a position on that?
Well, the short answer to the question, does Brave Angels take a political position on any given issue, is no. Although, as you might imagine, we have certainly been pushed from many different folks in many different directions to do exactly that in different periods of time, most notably in the aftermath of January 6th, Trump's claim of a stolen election and so forth. Of course, there's a wave of organizations in the civic space, even bipartisan ones, who did come out in condemnation of the president. There's two wrinkles to your question that I'm hearing. One is sort of on the question of policy, but then the other is on the question of the political conduct of a controversial figure like Donald Trump, or maybe an Ilhan Omar, or someone like that. On the policy front, let me just say that Braver Angels, even as I've just stated that we don't take political positions on policy, has nevertheless evolved over time to engage policy in more and more serious ways. And that's relevant to a current initiative that we have running called the American Hope Campaign, which I want to say a little bit about. But Braver Angels has begun providing vehicles for the development of consensus positions on pivotal policy issues that grassroots individuals can participate in, that Braver Angels does not necessarily endorse with respect to the positions they generate through that organizing vehicle, but we provide a process for which Americans from both sides of the aisle can work together to find common ground. And so, for instance, we have something called the Trustworthy Election Project, where we have gathered over the course of 3 years' time. So this began in 2022, forgive me. over the course of about 3 years' time, we gathered about 200 or so evenly balanced folks from the left and the right, about half of whom believed that the 2020 election was stolen through voter fraud and that voter fraud is a big problem in America, and the other half of whom believed that voter suppression, generally along racial lines and so forth, is a major problem in America. And across the course of about 26 workshops held in about 25 states with different portions of this 200-person cohort, began with the process that starts with relationship building, helping people in the Braver Angels fashion communicate with respect to what their personal relationship is to these issues and how they come to their convictions. But thereafter, engage in a process of identifying common ground on both values as well as policy, right? And the end of this larger process produced a body of 787 points of agreement on both values and policy that then was distilled to a policy recommendation report on the project containing policy recommendations of about 20 or so positions that were the outgrowth of bipartisan consensus through this project. Right, it included ideas along the lines of national holiday voting and voter ID, with the caveat that states take affirmative action with respect to ensuring adequate access to identification, things of this nature. There's a larger report that folks can look up called the Trustworthy Elections Report at Braver Angels website. In the aftermath of our recent convention, we had 700 plus delegates come out from across America. And again, these are artists, these are activists, these are scholars and politicians in some cases. These are folks from the philanthropic sector, the business sector, and students, and any other number of individuals who came out. And over the course of our 3-day convention, debated and sought common ground over what policy issue Braver Angels would tackle next in this vein. The result of that was a commitment to push forward a project seeking common ground on the subject of immigration reform. And so Braver Angels is pushing forward with that work, working with partner organizations like Numbers USA and others to do something similar. So on the policy engagement front, we don't endorse outcomes, but we do, in short, provide and endorse a process rooted in strengthening the culture of goodwill between the American people as a means towards opening up the space for actual material consensus, which we try to prove that can be done.
Can we talk about that in concrete terms? Excuse me, John. I just want to try to get us focused. So you look at process, not necessarily at taking a position. So in context of immigration and trying to promote a useful dialogue, a constructive, what does that look like? I mean, what are the impediments to an effective deliberation over the immigration question? And what can a fair-minded approach that is respectful of people who differ from you in terms of their position gain? I mean, is this like, how do you keep from a good piece of legislation from being bottled up? Is it about formulating a policy that neither side has thought of because it's somewhere in the middle and it requires compromise that they haven't been? You see what I'm asking you?
Well, I hear you asking me about process, and the starting point to all of our methods tends to be a focus on elevating the experiences of the people involved in the discussion. It's from there that we have tools for actually comparing, getting people to actually seek common ground on policy positions. It's the same general formula for immigration as it was for electoral reform and would likely be for any other policy point. The outcomes don't have to be new ideas, really. I think that most of the policy recommendations that grew out of this Trustworthy Elections project weren't necessarily new or novel ideas. What they did reflect, however, were policy positions that may have the potential for gaining a larger cross-partisan consensus in the larger body politic. But now, at the end of the day, Braver Angels' efforts are still a drop in the bucket in terms of the larger political back and forth over immigration reform. I don't expect what we have done, or electoral reform. I don't expect what we have done to necessarily lead to a breakthrough in Congress. Although, of course, in the ultimate hopefulness of things, we would like to see that happen. But what we at least want to demonstrate is the potential of the American people starting from a foundational commitment to goodwill and understanding each other in a deeper way across the partisan divide. We would like to be able to demonstrate, and have sought to demonstrate, the connection between that sort of transformation in our attitudes towards one another on the one hand, and our capacity to be able to think critically, constructively, and productively about policy reform and seeking common ground on policy reform on the other hand, right? So that's really the idea there, Glenn. And these efforts are still relatively nascent. I do want to be candid in saying that, but I think that there's a thought that we have, which is that ultimately, in a larger context where not only rank and file Americans are finding themselves deteriorating their ability to be in relationship with each other against the backdrop of a federal government and a Congress and a presidential political culture that seems more and more dysfunctional, that it's important to model a better way, really. And so that is what this is an attempt at on the policy front. And I'm happy to circle back to your question too on what is our relationship to Trump, et cetera, et cetera. But happy to pause on that point if you want to probe further.
Well, let me not belabor that. I mean, you can talk about Trump if you want to, but I'm interested in threats to American democracy and whether or not you see them in the political culture, the distrust of institutions leading to. So what do you think about Supreme Court reform, for example? The Supreme Court has become much more politicized, it seems to me, in recent period. You mentioned ballot access and voter ID, compromise, universal ID required, but affirmative efforts made to ensure people have access to ID. I'm wondering what's like that in some of the other areas. And is Trump an existential threat? I can remember in 2016 having some correspondence with David Blankenhorn, who's one of your principals, is he not? I mean, he's kind of like the force behind the
president and co-founder of Braver Angels. That's right.
As I recall, I hope I don't misquote him, he was very exercised about the prospect that Trump might become the Republican nominee, and ultimately he became president. And does Trump constitute a unique threat? I mean, is that something that a movement such as yours can acknowledge? I'm not saying he does necessarily. I know a lot of people think he does, and I know those people who think that he does think democracy is on the ballot, so to speak, and worry about the future of our republic. Anyway, I'm trying to provoke you into saying something partisan.
Well, I mean, look. Yeah. So let me dig into Trump here for a bit. First of all, let me just say, in a Braver Angels context, we have Trump supporters among our members on our board of directors. I am a registered Republican who is not a Trump supporter, although I have not voted for the Democratic ticket either. To tell you the truth, on the presidential level, I think I've been voting third party and independent since 2016 and likely to do so again this year. So that makes it easier for me personally to squiggle out of that question a little bit. But however, I've always felt that the important thing to understand about Trump, and others have said this, is that Trump is more symptom than cause, even as he in his own person, I do believe, represents a fundamental inflection point in the trajectory of our democratic society, just in terms of inflaming the passions of polarization and so forth. But, what we were already dealing with prior to Trump, that I do think that Donald Trump exploited, is a trust deficit between the American people and each other and the American people and their institutions, very much itself exacerbated by the new technologies of social media and a proliferating informational landscape in which, the quickest path to gain ratings as well as votes is to not try and speak to all Americans, but to achieve market share dominance among conservatives. If you're Fox News or now Newsmax or MSNBC, progressives, if you're MSNBC or Young Turks or what have you, that has put us in a position to where we can't speak to each other effectively. We can't understand each other. We can't empathize with the moral starting points that we bring to political conversations. I think that Donald Trump swung like a wrecking ball into that pre-existing culture. And I think that on the Democratic side, there has been a deep lack of reflectiveness with respect to the larger sort of culture of, I think, contempt and snobbery that oftentimes, I think, emits from the language of liberal elites and various Democratic politicians towards conservative America in so many different ways, that it's left us in a place where you almost can't imagine what it would look like for a politician to genuinely run seeking to unite all Americans. You almost can't even imagine what it would sound like in 2024 for that to be the case. Because at this point, what we're used to is the hard, bludgeoning language of cultural warfare. We are in the age of the culture wars, right? And I think that that's really what I want to see us pull out of. That's what I want to see us find a way to transcend, while recognizing the fact that the only reason why we are prone towards culture war to begin with is because we have deep-seated convictions that come from some authentic places with respect to what is right and what is wrong. And even as those convictions may find themselves exploited by the political class or the media class, they still have to be engaged honestly. They still have to be engaged frankly. And so Braver Angels is trying to establish containers and frameworks within which that can happen, alongside a concurrent commitment to maintaining a thread of goodwill and and empathy, to use the word, for people whose convictions run in a different direction, but who nevertheless have some redeeming humanity and some connection to us as our American family, friends, and neighbors. That is the balance we're trying to strike, and it's difficult because I think that it is hard for people to understand how that could be possible in a day and age such as this. And yet, what happens to America if we don't accomplish that? Are we reconciled to the inevitability of revolution or a cold or hot civil war, the normalization of political violence? I'm of the point of view that it's one or the other. We either find a way to humanize each other and take that seriously as a political and social project that ought to be at the center of our concerns, or we begin to adapt ourselves to the idea that maybe the fracturing of the union, the decline, the deterioration of our institutions, and the breaking down of the American experiment into something other than most of us, I think, would want it to be, is an inevitability that we simply have to accept. I don't understand what the other scenario is, absence a deeper commitment to reconciliation between Americans.
Well, you may be right. Either we find a way to get along or we fight each other. That might be almost a tautology. If we don't find a way of getting along, we will be at each other's throats. But I'm just wondering if there aren't some issues for which there is no way to get along. One side has to prevail. I'm thinking of slavery and the Civil War and asking myself the question, could the Civil War have been avoided? And I'm not sure I can make the case that it could have been avoided, that there was, quote unquote, compromise that was possible given the array of forces and interests and values as they stood in 1860, 1861. I don't know Trump is trying to make this move on abortion. He's saying it's going to the states, saying I'm not for a national ban on abortion. I'm for letting the states sort it out. That whatever. You could see where that might be a kind of can't we all just get along solution. You got 50 jurisdictions. Let jurisdictions, it's Democratic people differ between Kentucky and Massachusetts. Let's let them sort it out. You don't have to win. Could be the mantra. You don't have to have an imposition of your values on everybody. You can let people out, but I doubt it. I doubt it seriously. I mentioned some of the foreign policy fiascos. I don't know how you finesse the deep conflicts on this anti-Semitism question. On the one hand, you've got people who are saying, you want the destruction of Israel, you're pro-Hamas. On the other hand, you got people who are saying civilian slaughter, you need a ceasefire. I'm not sure there's a difference to be split there. And, you say that mutual respect, even if we can't agree. I saw your passionate speech at the convention, the excerpts from it in that little short that you linked me to. And you were quite in Baptist preacher mode. I don't know if you got a Baptist preacher in your background there, but you were really holding forth on behalf of the idea that we don't have to agree, but we can at least recognize that we're not bad people just because we don't agree with each other about this or that. And I'm just wondering, okay, I can agree with that, but how much traction does that have when the conflicts that we're talking about are as sharply drawn as those that I've been referring to just now?
Yeah, it's the type of thing that fairly few people disagree with that premise. But then at scale, it becomes a very difficult idea to sell to the larger sort of political world, really. I mean, for one, I think it does cut against the entrenched interests of the political media and the political parties, just given the business model of those institutions sort of being rooted in kind of balkanizing the American people to begin with. But then too, I mean, just to your point about slavery in the mid 19th century, I think that many people wrestle with this idea of like, well, at some point you have to take a stand against evil, right? Or at the very least, at some point, the differences between us are so deeply entrenched that perhaps conflict of an uglier sort is inevitable. And even if you don't want to believe that's true, you might slip into not being able to see how it could be any other way. I think that for me, I do have this sense that one thing that is vital to my own understanding of human nature is that conscience is a real thing. I refer to the nonviolent philosophy of Martin Luther King Jr. and its substance as sort of a guiding light for me in understanding this. I mean, Dr. King believed that the foundation of philosophical nonviolence for Dr. King was this idea that love is a spiritual force that can affect social transformation, right? That in being able to signal goodwill to your opponent, you're able to do two things. One, you maximize your ability to be able to speak to that individual's conscience by showing him that even if you are in disagreement, you are not fundamentally his enemy. And that two, even if you fail to move your opponent in the space of a single interaction or encounter, you at least alleviate from yourself the burden of hatred, judgment, and fear, and contempt. In the era of slavery, you did have an issue that, as it happened, war was the pathway towards the liberation of the slaves. It's hard to prove a negative, but what also pre-existed the Civil War was a deep culture of contempt and polarization that existed between the North and the South, not just along political lines, but along cultural lines. It was a different class of Anglo immigrants who populated the North and populated the South. And folks in reference Thomas Sowell's white liberals and black rednecks and so forth for some analysis on that front. But there were deep religious, philosophical, and cultural divisions that eroded the relationship between Northerners and Southerners in America, such that any sort of moral reconciliation on the subject of slavery, if it were possible in the abstract, could never have been possible in the culture of contempt that pre-existed the advent of Abraham Lincoln. So it's hard to answer that question definitively, but I do believe that, and see, part of the difficulty here too is that eventually, you come back to the first principles of religion and philosophy. I do believe that the answer here lies in the deeper questions of how it is you summon forth the better angels of our nature, how it is you summon forth our deeper commitment to the idea that we can see the goodness in each other regardless of how ugly we are and how ugly we act on the surface or how reprehensible our views are. It is the reason I speak like a Baptist preacher when I get up there on the stage, Glenn, is because I am sort of trying to call forth the Holy Spirit a little bit, or to allow it to be called forth through me. It takes a revival and not necessarily, merely consensus, meetings on abortion or this policy or that. That's not really the test, even if it's a desirable outcome. What we need in America is a revival. What we need in America is, even if you're not religious, a spiritual transformation in our attitudes towards one another, such that we are no longer content to believe that our humanity is defined by our politics. That's the message that has to get through, because otherwise the threshold is too high. The threshold is too high. If we have to achieve bipartisan alignment on all the cultural war issues and all the policy issues in ways to where nobody any longer feels morally offended by anything anybody else thinks or believes, if we have to come to a place to where the material impacts of our politics no longer harm each other, if me wanting to, believing that we should defund the police and that results in an increase in crime and murder in a certain municipality, you would have a reasonable basis for not forgiving me for ever having endorsed that position, because in the way I'm drawing out this hypothetical context, what I believe politically materially harmed you. If I believe that we should shut down the border, and suddenly you've got relatives who are trying to get in, looking for a better life, for good people who want to join their family on the other side of the border, and that can't happen because I've decided to support a position that's antithetical to your interests and that of your family. You may have some grounds for not forgiving me for that, right? But if we get stuck there, then violence is the only way to break the impasse, and that's what I return to. I fear, and maybe I'm going through my own sort of little identity crisis and all this, but I do fear that part of the reality here is trying to introduce a spiritual and a moral approach to a political and material universe, and I think that that's very much needed. But opening the door for the conversation to expand in that way, I think, is the challenge. And so again, I go back to Dr. King, because prior to Martin Luther King Jr. and the nonviolent movement, the civil rights efforts, as they were led by Roy Wilkins and the NAACP and A. Philip Randolph and great men of that stature, was nevertheless principally a legal and a political movement. But the real transformation in the heart of America, and again, this isn't to say that Dr. King and the nonviolent movement solved everything. I mean, that's a larger conversation. It did not. But it didn't become transformational.
He was assassinated after all.
Absolutely.
I'm sorry, I was just interjecting
right.
to say he was assassinated. I mean, that.
But even in that, right.
Go ahead.
No, I mean you're right. You're right to mention that. But of course, even in that sacrifice, it solidified the moral case that he was making in the spiritual terms that he was making it, I believe. again, this idea that if we are committed to seeing the dignity in our opponents, we can push forward the material policies of American society in ways that reflect that. And even if we disagree on that, we can still find a way to strive towards the beloved community across those divisions. That message has been a wellspring of hope for America since that time, and that was solidified by King's assassination in a way, not without saying too much, in a way that sort of reflects the Christian conviction. Jesus's suffering and death on the cross, opening up the path for others to come unto salvation. Right? I'm drawing an analogy. I'm not trying to say King's Christ or anything like that, but there is a way in which being willing to suffer in the cause of humanizing even your opponents makes the space for redemption and reconciliation and forgiveness and goodwill in a way that's unavailable to us, I fear.
So tell us about American Hope. This is an initiative that grew out of your most recent convention. Do I get that correct? And what is it, and how does it jibe with what we've been talking about so far?
Well, that is correct. And I do encourage folks to check out braverangels.org and to look into the American Hope campaign. It rests on three pillars. On the one hand, we are gathering Americans on the subject of immigration reform through the sorts of methods and workshops that I've laid out, get to know one another's personal experiences related to the issue so we can forge policy common ground and produce a set of recommendations that then can be surfaced in the larger conversation over immigration reform in American society. That's piece number one. Piece number two, however, Braver Angels volunteers will be taken to polling places across America in red-blue pairs, by the way, Democrats, Republicans, I guess Kamala Harris voters potentially, and Donald Trump supporters side by side, to campaign for Americans in front of Americans near polling stations on Election Day, introducing them to this work, introducing them to this movement, and bringing people into an effort to achieve a moral transformation in the way that we engage politics and democracy.
I'm sorry, are these election monitors? Excuse me, I just want to be clear about the second prong. Are they monitoring the election?
These are Braver Angels volunteers who will be setting up shop in the vicinity.
Or are you recruiting? I'm just trying to figure out what the function is. Are you recruiting additional members of Braver Angels around the polling places?
That's correct. Recruiting new members and volunteers to Braver Angels grassroots work. And the third is to directly petition the political parties through a petition drive that we'll be circulating, and volunteers will be driving in local communities and other spaces across the country to add a commitment to depolarization to the Republican and Democratic Party platforms in future cycles. And so we'll be working on immigration reform, bringing people into the movement, and also challenging the political parties directly to reckon with polarization as a central area of focus that they should and must acknowledge in their own proposed visions for the future of American politics. And so those are the three legs of the stool of the American Hope campaign. And our hope is that the American people will heed the call, and that together we might be able to create momentum behind a revival of goodwill that can also impact the way we do business in American politics. And so that is the hope and that is the dream.
All right, John. I am glad to lend the audience of the Glenn Show to give them an opportunity to learn about the work that you're doing. John Wood, who is the National Ambassador for Braver Angels, which is a nonpartisan membership organization, grassroots, promoting understanding and dialogue across partisan divide, concerned about the future of American democracy, trying to shore up the social and spiritual bonds that allow us to disagree without being disagreeable. So thanks very much, John, for coming on The Glenn Show.
It's always an honor, my friend. Thank you, Glenn.